Hello, everyone, and welcome to this first session on day 2 of the conference. I wanted to start off by just congratulating Access on bringing everyone together for these conversations over the last 20 years. It's such a wonderful milestone, and I think particularly today we might be biased, but it's a great topic to talk about and for giving us the opportunity to have this conversation. So I think to start off, I wanted to actually reflect a little bit on conversations that we had yesterday and about the evolution of the financial services landscape over the last 2 decades, the absolutely revolutionary change that we have seen in the supply ecosystem over these 20 years. I think today with the India Stack and digital public infrastructure, there's a vast and complex network of supply. And really for us, that next frontier now is how to understand and unpack demand. When you look at the numbers, they're truly staggering, as with most things in India. In August, we crossed 10 billion UPI transactions in a month, which was a global benchmark. When one actually starts to but look at the flip side of that number, if you look at these 10 billion transactions, there's 600 million people in India, users who don't have digital access, who struggle to actually make these digital transactions. And what we want to do today is actually move past some of these statistics and these numbers and place that user at the center of this conversation. Really who that person is, what is her day like, how does she take decisions, how does she engage with her family and her peers, how does she engage with financial services. And in doing this, using behavior science as a tool and a way to really understand that customer and how we can place them at the center of our own decision making as financial service providers and interventions. I have with me today a panel of experts. I just wanted to call out where we do have Jigisha from Quicksand, who's delayed by the traffic and will be joining us very soon. But we have, between them, we have a wealth of experience that they bring across their work and their organizations, and I'm very excited to draw on their insights and learnings from this. And I hope that everyone in this room today leaves this conversation feeling as excited about behavior science, I think, as all of us definitely are. Today's conversation, I wanted to structure it across 2 rounds of questions for each of the panelists. We're hoping to have time for a quick rapid round at the end. So just give us a time check when we have about 10 minutes to go. And we do have 2 live poll questions during the session. I'll just call out to you when they're up, and do check on your web apps. We'd love for you to use it as a way to share your own thoughts and engage with the session as well. So I wanted to start off our first question really looking at behavior science. You know, what is the behavior science approach? What is it as a strategy? And how do we use it to understand deeper, better engagement for customers for financial and digital services? And I wanted to start with you, Kanika. For the work that IDEO has been doing, you've worked across multiple geographies and segments. Are there principles and approaches that have sort of cut through a lot of these? And particularly, if you can also talk a bit about this idea of resistance to change, which is sometimes the most fundamental first step towards changing someone's behavior. So would love to hear from you.
Hi, everyone. Can you hear me? Hi, I'm Kanika. Maybe before I jump in, I'll take a quick moment to introduce you to IDEO. For those of you that are not familiar with IDEO, we're a design consulting organization. We're present globally and more popularly known for having pioneered the concept of design thinking. And design thinking is really an approach to building products, services, or organizations by centering it around the people who are going to use that product or service or work in that organization. And at IDEO, especially in India, we work on a project called Last Mile Money, and this is in collaboration with the Gates Foundation. It's a 5-year innovation program where over the last 4.5 years, we're nearing the end of this program, we worked with over 100 different digital financial service organizations, from small fintechs to large banks and large corporations, to help them think more specifically about what it means to make digital financial services more relevant and accessible to people who are new to the digital economy and not as savvy or digitally confident as the rest of us maybe in this room. With that said, maybe I'll answer your question, Urmi. So at IDEO, I think, hi, Jikisha. At IDEO, right now I want to maybe touch on 3 kind of thoughts that I have when it comes to taking a more customer-centric approach to product design. The first is, maybe those of you that are familiar with IDEO would have seen this concentric circle that we talk about, which is everything starts with asking, how is what you're building relevant or desirable to the customer? So what is really the job that what you're building does in that customer's life? Without knowing exactly what task or what activity you're fulfilling for this particular customer, there is really no solution that is that the customer is willing or excited to use. So really everything should start with asking, how does this fit into their life? Why is it desirable for them? And what are they willing to do to use your product or service? But of course, alongside that, we have 3 other concentric circles, one of which is to, alongside thinking about customer desirability, to think about business viability. So can you make this work at a price point that the customer is able to pay for it, or is someone else willing to pay for it? And does that work for your business and for your sustainability? And of course, alongside that, something that's very important is the feasibility aspect. And here I think more and more when we think about last mile customers, sometimes we tend to forget, we think about feasibility more from, can I build this app or product or service? But can the other person use it? Do they have the means and wherewithal to use it? For instance, if your app is too heavy, they're actually unwilling to give you space on their phone. So how do we think of feasibility both from your organization standpoint, but also from the customer standpoint? Are they willing to give you space on their phone if it's a product? Are they willing to give you time in their life if you're expecting them to go up to a banking correspondent? So is it feasible in their day-to-day life? And the fourth one that we have also more recently introduced is around responsibility. How responsible is your product or service to the environment and to the person? Are you taking into consideration potential unintended consequences? Are you asking yourself the tough questions, and are you evaluating the trade-offs as you're making these decisions? So one of it, when we think about behavior science, of course it starts with customer desirability, but all the other 3 concentric circles also always tie back to, does this make sense to the customer? I think the second thing is, to answer both your questions, Jigisha, around an empathy gap. So I think we sometimes tend to forget the switching cost from what people are used to today to what we're expecting them to do. And so very actively thinking about what the alternatives are in their life and making your product or service reflect or mimic some of the jobs that the alternate actually fulfills, especially when it comes to cash and digital, right? The tangibility of cash, it's very hard to match up to that. And so how do we actively and intentionally think about what that alternate that you're asking them to switch out of provides for them? We tend to forget that when we believe that our product is superior to the other. And the last one that I'd like to talk about is this concept called the pace, the layers of pace of change. Change does not need to happen all at once. Not everyone needs to move at the same pace. And sometimes the friction of a slower mover and a fast mover is actually good because it pushes you to make a product that's more relevant to them. And so appreciating and sitting in that tension is another thing that we think about, where not everything has to happen on day one, maybe not even in year one, maybe not even in year 10, but allowing for that pace of change to happen more naturally, more organically, and in a way that feels inclusive to their needs. So I would say broadly, these are the three kind of principles or approaches we think about when talking about trying to move someone and make a behavior change, especially in their life.
Thank you. Thanks, Kanika. And I think it's so interesting to think about that idea of switching cost and how you build a value proposition that's motivating and strong enough to actually nudge them towards that. And this idea of the learning pace, we see in our own trainings at Swadhar, there are groups of clients who are so mixed in where they start in their journeys, and so how you learn from your peers and imbibe that pace, I think is very interesting. And I wanted to then move to you, Anushka, to talk a little bit about the work that Final Mile, has done across not only inclusion but also sectors like education and health, and something like building this strong value proposition, how you've seen that happening and some of the principles that you've seen apply.
Thank you so much. Can you hear me, everyone? Yeah, perfect. So firstly, thank you so much for inviting me here and being on a panel. Like you said, Urmi, very excited to be talking about behavioral design in the context of financial inclusion, something that's very important as well, given all the questions that were asked in the crystal ball gazing session, etc. So before I start, I'll also just introduce Final Mile so everyone gets a context of the kind of work we do. So I work at this company called Final Mile. We aim to solve complex, sorry. Yeah, we aim to solve complex behavior problems in health, like Urmi said, financial inclusion, WASH-related behaviors, by providing a behavioral science as well as a design lens to first understand the problem and frame the problem correctly, and then see how we can solve the problem by designing the environment in a way that allows the positive behavior to actually occur. And I think within financial inclusion or financial empowerment, like we'd like to look at it, we've done a lot of projects on driving engagement with PMJDY accounts, trying to design behaviorally informed consent artifacts because privacy and data privacy is such an important area. We've also worked with Swadhar currently on trying to reimagine what financial literacy or financial capacity building actually means, as well as designing sustainable cash transfer programs in Tanzania. So I'll try and give you some examples as well. As I kind of go through the session. But I thought maybe I could also talk a little bit about, given we're such a heterogeneous cohort of users, in terms of what behavior science is and therefore what is the value of behavior science, incremental to all the interesting perspectives you already have in the room. So behavior science is very interdisciplinary and it draws from academic disciplines of psychology, cognitive science, cultural anthropology, as well as behavioral economics, trying to build a more real understanding of how people make decisions, and we use that understanding of how people actually make decisions to be able to design interventions that allows for positive behavior change overall. And I think it's very critical to get to the why people are behaving the way they do in order to solve the solution, rather than enter with the idea that we understand what needs to happen and therefore we could just build awareness or change in order to drive that positive behavior change overall. And it's also important to acknowledge the fact that behavior science and design work really well to provide a process that moves from not only understanding insights that are centered in the user in terms of how they make decisions, to move towards designing solutions, prototyping the solutions with our end user as well as key stakeholders, and then working towards actually piloting and thinking about scale and implementation, because that's not a separate part. This is not just an academic discipline for research, it's more about getting to implementation and measuring impact in terms of whatever we do. And I also want to mention the fact that behavior science and design, I think, are another lens we can look at to solve complex behavior problems, because I think it's not the only lens, it's not the most important lens, but rather it is an additional lens to think about when we're looking at solving these complex behavior problems overall. So one thing that I might want to talk a little bit about, like Urmi, you mentioned, right? We talked a lot about PMJDY accounts. We talked a lot about the fact that it's the largest financial inclusion exercise, but of course, there's high amount of dormancy, inactivity, low amounts of money in the accounts. So how do we actually think about this problem slightly differently and get to the idea of real inclusion where actually people are using these accounts, right? We need to start off by having a fundamental understanding that just awareness and access, like the example of PMJDY accounts, is important, but it's not sufficient for behavior change. You need to think very consciously about how are we actually changing behavior in order for people to adopt or engage with those accounts. Because I think generally we have this assumption that if we have awareness, by default, and people have access, they will intend to use the product. If they intend to use the product, they will act on the product. If they act on the product, they will continuously use the product. But the idea from behavior science is that that's not how we as human beings actually make decisions, right? Just because I'm aware or have access to doesn't necessarily mean that I'm motivated to use. Even if I have an intention to use, doesn't necessarily mean that I'm going to act on that intention. If I act on that intention once or use that bank account once, doesn't necessarily mean that I'm going to use it again, right? Because technically there are gaps between each of those linear journey that I did mention. And behavior science really helps you reduce those gaps between just awareness creation to relevance creation, right? From intention, reducing that gap to action. From action, thinking a lot about adherence or habits as well, because that's what's going to really result in sustainable behavior change and not just short-term behavior change overall. And I think if you're thinking about the PMJDY accounts, I think it's important to understand what is the context of the user, right? What are his or her mental models? What is the existing competitive set of options that they can go to instead of these accounts? And if you think about it, it's not that the underserved or the unbanked did not know how to manage their money, right? Or they're bad at managing money. It's actually the idea that they're in a context or a mindset of scarcity, where they're always tunneled into managing their current immediate needs, and everything about the future and future management is almost outside this cognitive tunnel that they're looking at. And if you think about formal finance, I think that falls outside the tunnel and the bank accounts fall outside the tunnel. And what is inside the tunnel is actually informal finance, right? Because it's very relevant, it's very certain, it kind of helps with those urgent situations of money overall. And therefore, you actually see people more inclined to informal finance rather than formal finance overall. And when you think about when you ask people why they don't use the bank accounts, they always mention the idea of like physical distance, which of course is an issue. But we also need to think about how this might be a rationalization, because what they're actually talking about is also psychological distance that they do feel from the formal financial sector, right? It's not for me, it's for other people. I feel because every interaction is so cognitively and emotionally taxing when they're interacting with formal finance, that we also need to think about reducing not physical, but the psychological distance that I might feel also. And how do we think about interventions in that way? And I think the last thought I wanted to talk a little bit about is also the idea that everyone said it's important to focus on financial literacy. But I don't think it's about literacy, because literacy feels like you just have to tell people what they need to do. But it's not about that, because firstly it needs to be not literacy, but relevant in terms of what do we communicate. But also I think we have to learn from how people are interacting with informal finance, right? Because a lot of the complex ideas about interest, compounding interest is not unheard of. It's actually understood in the context of informal finance. It's just about how do we get people to think about process literacy in terms of not only explaining why it's relevant, but how to use. And I feel like that is the critical part in terms of financial literacy campaigns overall. And maybe later on I could talk a little bit more specifically around how we can think about and what we're doing with Swadhar as well.
Thank you. No, I think this idea of that psychological distance and how even a simple, those steps of the process and process literacy helps. And I think that's particularly that's even more complex for when one starts to look at the digital ecosystem and how you engage with that. And I wanted to also welcome Jigisha to the panel. And I just wanted to pull you in to talk a little bit about the work that Quicksand has been doing, across, again, many different sectors and segments. But also, as you talk of that, if you can talk a little more about how you've used some of these principles to look at engagement with the digital ecosystem.
Right. Thank you, Urmi. And first off, I'm really sorry about the absolute late entry. But thank you for still accommodating me, and and it was lovely hearing all of your responses. I'm sorry I missed yours, but I'm going to take you up on it later. But thank you for the question, and I think behavioral science, we cannot look at it in isolation. We also have to look at human-centered design, because both of them together make really powerful tools to understand what are the decision-making factors that people have when they're looking to engage with a digital or a financial ecosystem. And it's not just from their point of view, but also from the provider's point of view, that if they understand the decision-making parameters in a lot of depth, it becomes even more fruitful, sort of relevant engagement, what you were saying. So for the past 2 years, we've been conducting a study called Digital Finance for All. We've met over 200 users and non-users of digital financial services. And what we've been able to do is we've integrated human-centered design and behavioral science in a way that we're able to conduct interviews and discover a lot of interesting stories and observations and document a lot of rich media. And much later, at the analysis stage, we're able to use behavioral science frameworks to situate these learnings in a lot more meaningful and thoughtful manner. These have sort of helped us arrive at a lot of, start building what is the mental model that users have when they're looking to engage with a digital ecosystem, and what are some of these factors that the providers can also leverage. I'll give you some examples. Now we know that, our study has been done across 5 states, and I'll just pick some anecdotes from here and there. We know that women, are most often accompanied by a male member of their family, most likely their husband or their fathers or brothers, when they have to go to the bank or do some sort of a financial activity. In a scenario when the male member is not available, the women sort of find their friends or other women friends, and they sort of accompany each other to a bank, and it's sort of like a collective confidence that they have, that we together have the ability to solve the problem at hand. That's one scenario. The second scenario I want to talk about is that there's a lady in Maharashtra, in Osmanabad, who started using UPI for her home kitchen, where she's cooking food and she's selling it to people around. She's struggling. She knows that it is going to be a difficult journey, but she has a lot of faith in her own capabilities, and she's being extra vigilant to look out for fraudulent situations, cross-checking everything. Now, the point that I'm trying to make is that when you integrate behavioral science and human-centered design, it helps us look at behaviors in a very granular manner. That these are very absolute moment of truth sort of decisions and behaviors that people are taking, which can be leveraged to understand how can we best utilize this knowledge to create meaningful engagement in the context of the study, it's into digital financial ecosystem, but also a digital ecosystem overall. And if you look at the intersection when gender, digital and finance, everything comes together, all of these factors become even more complex. So some of the examples I've given you are around trust and social norms, which play out in a really, really large way when women have to access not just digital but also financial services. But there are other factors, like you mentioned, access, and it's not just physical accessibility, it's also digital accessibility. Do I have a phone? Am I able to, is the service understandable enough for me to access it? Am I even eligible to access it? Am I eligible to get an Aadhaar, to get a PAN card, for example? And then there are many other factors like, do I have the confidence in my own capabilities to learn a service? Do I trust the service provider? And because there are enough and more stories of fraud going around, so there's so much more at stake, and it's a really risky situation to be in. So there are many such consideration factors that people have. The point I want to make is that it's because when you bring human-centered design and behavioral science together, it really helps us understand what are these small factors which may seem insignificant in the larger scheme of things, but are actually what makes or breaks a person's own decision or the system's decision to include them into a digital and financial ecosystem. Because I'm taking DeFi for All's example, it's largely related to finance, but at Quicksand, we're a design thinking consultancy. We've used these frameworks for other use cases as well, health being a most common one, and education as well. We try our best to not tie ourselves down to one framework, but also get a lot of contextual information. I think personally, we also draw a lot of joy from trying to create our own frameworks. But yes, I think that's how I feel. And it's not, I strongly feel it's not just behavioral science. It provides a lot of academic spine to a lot of on-ground stories and user experiences, and helps us situate them within that.
Thank you. No, I think it's fascinating to hear about some of these approaches, and I think every time we try to look at that user as an individual and this vast multitude of almost mental models that you are trying to imagine for them, and there's so much complexity and diversity, and I wanted to come to you, Shogato, to talk a bit, through your work at Ideas 42 and now at Venn Advisors. You've seen and done behavior science work across many diverse segments, geographies, different kinds of customers. Can you talk a little bit about how behavior science as a strategy also caters to this diversity so that interventions are effective in taking into account all of that complexity that we see?
Thank you so much, Urmi, and thank you for, I can use this one. Can you hear me? Yeah, okay. For inviting me to this panel. And it's been really interesting to actually listen to the other panelists, because I think that the conversation so far has really encapsulated the reason I think that we all think this is a useful set of tools. I loved Anushka's use of the phrase "a lens," right? It's not a silver bullet. It's not going to solve all problems, but I think it's a way of looking at things that, exactly as you said, Urmi, because there is so much diversity and so much variation in both what people's needs are, but also the context in which they live, the context in which they interact with different kinds of programs or services or products, that we have to find ways to incorporate all of that into the way that we design solutions. And one thing that's always struck me in some sense about a lot of the social sector is, we sort of, you hear a lot of talk about how do we get people to engage with this? And the interesting thing is, if you think about it, that's kind of backwards from the way that, like, say, a product would be designed, right? We would say, if people have a need for a product, then we design it in a way that we shouldn't have to kind of get them to engage with it, right? And so I think if you build in this kind of behavioral lens from the very beginning, then you are more likely to have something that doesn't then require additional effort to say, why is this kind of... What's that? Okay. sorry, I'm waving my hands around too much. So I think if you incorporate the behavioral lens from the very beginning, I think you're less likely to come up against some of these barriers. And in my experience, one of the limitations in some ways is that, especially when we are thinking about an intervention, right? Or a design change, or a tweak, or a nudge, we're almost by definition catering to what we think is the average. So we're going to leave out a lot of people on either side of that, and there's going to be a lot of variation. And that's actually, one of the reasons, and I was just chatting before the panel with a few others about my journey from Ideas 42, where we're implementing a lot of different projects in different sectors, but always, I think, being very concerned about the sustainability of what we achieve in terms of behavior change, in terms of the, you talked about repeated use versus, one time, habit formation, all of these things. And I think that's where, in some ways, my feeling is that we need to, on the one hand, make better use of tools like machine learning, where we can mine the wealth of data we have to actually tailor these interventions to different segments, right? Different mental models and so on. And the second piece is, I think, thinking of more nimble ways to incorporate behavioral science at different parts of the product or the program journey without necessarily insisting that we have to run a trial or we have to get rigorous data, because that's simply not always going to be possible with the kind of timelines and the time of constraints that program designers face, right? So, or product designers face. And I think that is where trying to be more responsive, you know, as a discipline, I think would be quite helpful. So that's part of the reason why a bunch of us got together and said, you know, what can we do something where we're really focused on using what we know to as quickly and nimbly solve problems for the sector. And that's the genesis of this Venn Advisors thing, which is new and getting started, but let's see where we go. So thank you.
Thank you so much. And I think it's very interesting to what you said about, you know, it's not a Band-Aid you apply at the end of the product design process saying how do we get them to engage, but really something that becomes a very core part of how you look at designing a product or process. And that's a perfect segue into the next round of questions that I wanted to get into, where often sometimes learnings from, you know, when you talk about behavior science, they can seem slightly esoteric or intangible, but really I wanted to talk also a little bit about how do you move past what you have on paper, make it actionable, make it implementable, and I think wearing that implementer's hat also, how do I make it operationally efficient to actually use this on the field. So I wanted to move to that, and I'm just going to, I think we might have our first live poll question up. So at some point, the first question relates to some of what we discussed. Do take a minute to look at that and punch in. I'm not able to see the answers, but we will do that at the end of the session for sure. I wanted to then come back to you, Kanika, you know, the financial confidence playbook that you've been designing as a part of Last Mile Money. There have been lots of learnings there for you in terms of the must-haves of how to design products. If you can talk a bit about that, but also as we look at, you know, the next 3 years, 5 years of how the ecosystem develops, how we see people engage, what are some of the future challenges that you feel you see the need to address as we do this?
Use this. Yeah, thanks, Urmi. So the financial confidence playbook is available for everyone to use. We can share that later. It's essentially a library of all of the prototypes we've built, and many of them are today in different stages of launch and in market and scale across emerging markets. And some of the things relate back to what all of you have spoken about. It's those small behavioral nuggets or stories that we tend to, like you mentioned, Jigisha, we tend to think are not so significant, but actually very significant. So I can refer to a few and talk about how we went from understanding that to implementing it. When we went out, we were speaking with women users in rural Maharashtra around their savings model. And surprisingly, and this is probably because they're all part of the Mandeshi Bank, they all were actually quite familiar and aware of recurring deposit products, fixed deposit products. In fact, many of them were using these products. And when we asked them how they make decisions and how do they know what they're earning on the product, many of them told us कि हर 100 रुपए के लिए मैं 1 रुपए बनाती हूँ. That's how they calculate interest. Whereas when we went back and looked at fintech products that are even designed for such users, the way interest or the way we communicate how they're earning on that savings product is a percentage. And so what we recommended and what we've designed in multiple savings products that we've designed is to change the language to be one that is contextually relevant to their digital and financial literacy levels, which is for every 100 rupees, you earn 1 rupee or you earn 10 rupees. Allow them to interact with a calculator and say, how much do you want to save? How much do you want to earn at the end of what time period, to allow them to feel a part of this decision making and to break down these complex terms. And we saw in Pakistan, in fact, this calculator around credit worked really well for women because they actually think in these mental models. It's just that they are typically presented on a screen in text, sometimes in large numbers and visuals, but rarely in an interactive format. And so we created a credit calculator that is actually working very well with rural merchants in Pakistan. Another such principle or a must-have that I think is, goes back to one of your points, which is moving away from singular to collective. These communities, actually sometimes even us, we operate in collectives. We tend to take decisions in collectives, or at least we seek advice in collectives. Many of them still operate in phygital worlds. And so instead of thinking of a bilateral engagement when we're designing a product or a service, we need to think of a collective engagement model. We need to think of what are those handover moments, what are those moments of trust and information sharing that need to be designed for within the product experience. So for example, when I'm a self-help group member and my bookkeeper is recording my transaction, it's a pretty opaque process for someone, especially in the digital world. If this bookkeeper just, inputs it in her phone, is there a maker checker moment that we can design within that? And in fact, we, advised NRLM and a couple of other partners of theirs on how to build that maker checker model, how to build that moment of interaction within the product experience. And so it's very important to be intentional about moving away from, these singular bilateral relationships or engagements to more collective engagements. The last kind of must-have, I would say, is moving away from all at a time to more one at a time. And we think of this as a way to build digital and financial confidence. I think there's a tendency among product designers or service designers to show customers everything that's relevant for them. And that's a lot, that's overwhelming. There's a lot of cognitive overload. And there's many times a feeling of this is probably not for me, this is for someone who has more financial literacy. And it's probably you're creating the same kind of trust deficit that sometimes people feel in a bank because a bank structure by itself is overwhelming. And so we like to call this progressive onboarding, or we like to call it a look before you leap approach, where can you reduce the number of steps required before they enter your app or product? KYC is a very overwhelming process. Can we allow them to get a flavor of what it's like before they have to give you a lot of their personal identifiable information? Or can you slowly introduce them to new features on your app? So these are some examples. But I think ultimately, when it comes to making this relevant for such customers, I think it boils down to probably three things, right? Is it affordable? By which they don't just mean, can I pay for it today? By which they also mean, is it cheaper than what I'm doing today? And or if it's more expensive, is that additional difference worth it? Is it valuable to me? Like, is it actually bringing something tangible? Without a tangible use case that exists in their life, it's very hard to get them to switch. And the last one is the accessibility part. We're all talking a lot about UPI and and digital, but I think we're going to continue to live in this high-tech, high-touch world that someone referred to yesterday. You know, even small, and there are ways to mimic this high touch. So I think the Paytm voice box was revolutionary in that sense, right? It brings that physical, personable experience without the need of having a person. And so how can we think more like that and bring more of that into the world is what I'd be thinking about from a behavior lens or design lens.
Thank you. No, it's very interesting to hear about some of these must-haves and exactly like you said, how you look at it one at a time, bring in some of these physical touch approaches into it. I wanted to actually move to you, Jigisha, to talk a little bit again about your work on onboarding customers for digital engagement and that journey of how that happens. Also in light of, I think for most of us in this room, engaging with technology is an ever-changing process. What I learned today might not, because of the pace at which the infrastructure is evolving, what I learned today might be not relevant 2 years from now. So when that entire ecosystem evolves at this pace, how do you also keep that in mind in terms of principles that you are using to guide the customer's engagement? So we'd love to hear that.
Right. Again, I'll keep referencing back to DeFi for all. Absolutely, when technology evolves with times, and that's what policymakers and providers strive to do, it's pretty clear that services will be more accessible to people. And I think of late there are some very good examples, like you said, the Soundbox, of very thoughtful innovation. So you have your UPI Lite, UPI 123, the Soundbox. At one of the centers, we had also seen a biometric device which had an audio beep as a signal to take your finger off the biometric, because generally people just tend to keep their thumb on it till somebody nudges you to take it off, or you just feel like it's been too long that my finger's been on the biometric. So I think these are just some examples of very thoughtful tech innovation that is happening, so it necessarily is not alienating always. However, I do feel that along with the evolution of tech, the education of tech is quite important. It's not enough to make big tech in big city till there's nobody to handhold you, or there are no people as such to help you adopt that technology at the last mile. I'll give 2 examples here. Now there's a merchant who is sitting in his marketplace, and we know that UPI agents go from shop to shop onboarding them. Now he's started using UPI, he's not educated. Ordinarily, it would have been outside of his socio-economic context to use a service like that, but he is using it now and in fact thriving because of that. That's one example. The other example I want to talk about are a group of women that we had met on the outskirts of Cherrapunji, where they, after having been employed with Manrega for about a couple of years, they suddenly decided to drop off because the DBT was getting digitized, and they just found it too complicated to link their job card with their bank account, with their Aadhaar card. So they just thought it's much better for us to forego. And even the nearest bank account is, 2 bus rides away. So it doesn't really make any sense. Now the key difference in both of these scenarios is that the merchant had an agent who was there to handhold him through the process, to teach him what to do, and also be there in times of exigencies and sudden support that you require. The women, while they were part of a formal collective, an SHG, but the SHG itself was not equipped to walk them through this adoption journey. So yeah, tech evolution is great. I think it's also happening in a lot of meaningful manner, but you do need people on the ground, and we've seen enough and more number of times that it's the banking agents, business correspondents, BC Sakhis, Jan Seva Kendras, CSCs, who are the people who are translating technology for people at the last mile. So tech evolution cannot happen without taking people along with you and employing people to translate that technology for everybody. And for all of us to basically achieve a certain level of digital competence, to be able to understand and, sort of, and of course all of this is like in an ongoing process, and they also have their own set of challenges. But I think this is a very tried and tested and a very solid solution that we've seen on the ground over the past 1 year of us traveling from city to city, that you need digital, all forms of digital right now is assisted, either formally or informally.
Thank you. I think that's the perfect link to actually, Anushka, the question I wanted to ask you, which is really around this hand-holding and the kinds of interventions that we design in order to train clients to engage with these systems. I wanted to actually ask you about the work that Final Mile and Swadhar that we are doing together around really understanding what these journeys look like for individual women. Coming back, Shogato, to also that idea of the heteronormative between amongst customers and how you understand individual customers' journeys. So we'd love to have you talk a little more about that.
Yes, very excited to talk about the work. And of course, like Sugato, building on the point about, I think when we talk about behavior science and the application, we always talk about nudges. But I think there's a lot of research now about not homogeneous groups, but heterogeneous groups that we're dealing with, right? And therefore, what is the distributive effect of nudges? And therefore, how we really need to move towards more tailored, more personalized nudging for specific segments or persona groups overall. And that's exactly what we're doing with Swadhar as well. So maybe I'll take some time to kind of talk a little bit about the work. So I think with Swadhar, the main aim is to try and reimagine what financial literacy actually means. And it's not, therefore, just the amount of trainings that are completed, but rather how we're actually moving people forward on their journey towards financial resilience, right? And not just inclusion, but rather resilience, which basically includes, of course, milestones with formal finance, but also enabling those tipping points, right? To make sure the family as a household is becoming more resilient and not really vulnerable to these financial disturbances that can potentially push people completely off their track or off their futures. So, of course, through Swadhar, we're doing a lot of, we have almost like a live lab in which we're like working very closely with end users to try and understand how they currently interact with their finances, and also more importantly trying to understand the decision making that happens at a household level, because while we might be talking to a woman, we have to understand that she's a member of a household and a lot of the decisions are made for her, not by her. And therefore it's not just about talking to one, but rather seeing how that translates to decision making that makes households more resilient as a whole. And therefore, when we're thinking about these pathways to financial resilience, I think it's important to understand that the starting point of a lot of women are quite different. Because even if you go to a village, I think it's easy to see there'll be one household which potentially has a younger bahu who does not have any access to money outside the household. She's not really has any agency because the mother-in-law is making a lot of decisions in terms of where the money goes. She's just given a very specific task, right? And she doesn't have too much mobility outside the household as well. So she's one person, but in the same village, you also do have an ASHA worker or like a small-scale entrepreneur running a kirana shop. And for her, she's very different, right? She has a higher level of agency and decision-making power in the household. She might already have some sort of formal interactions, but a lot of informal interactions as well. And what is the information that she needs to move ahead in her journey is quite different, right? And therefore, we wanted to kind of build off these different starting points to ensure that everyone is moving one step forward in an assisted way through financial capacity building overall. Which takes into account not only what is visible, which might be their formal financial interactions, but also what is invisible, which might be the level of agency and decision-making power she has. And when I'm talking about agency, I'm specifically talking about the capacity to act, the capacity to make choices based on her goals within the construct of the household as a whole, right? So we basically have almost like 4 agency-based personas that now are segments, because we have looked at quantification of these personas. And we basically have, for example, a passive observer, a frustrated fighter, an indifferent manager, and an optimistic influencer. And the idea is, if you're able to understand and locate where these people are, how do we think about financial literacy or financial capacity building in a way in which you're giving them the right information, enabling the right actions that might be very specific to the individual. So like I told you, the younger Bahu in a household, maybe the interaction for her is to start actually engaging with the finances, and number 2, trying to make her go to a BC point. Not trying to get her to adopt a saving scheme, because that's outside her tunnel. But when you're thinking about the ASHA worker or the small scale entrepreneur, for her is to think about like insurance products, right? Because she might already have savings products, she has the agency to make decisions, but she's not really thought about the future. And therefore, you're trying to make it aware that that's something that she might also have access to and want to do. And therefore, it's really about moving from a one-size-fits-all training to a more targeted approach that allows a trainer to kind of locate where the person is and therefore give them the specific actions that they need to actually do. And therefore, it's not only information, but it's also tied to action, but also more importantly, creating an enabling environment that allows her to constantly keep pushing forward on her journey. And therefore, I think with Swadhar, the idea is how do we create almost like a prabhavak in the community that might be already an influencer that they go to, but equipping them with the right information or the right connections of who they might need to speak to, which is a trainer who's capable and trusted to give that information, but also creating certain digital touch points which is accessible to them, right? That might be more like a WhatsApp chatbot rather than a separate application that they need to download that exists within a family phone rather than a phone that is hers. And therefore, you're talking to the household as a whole. So I think this is the way in which we're really like reimagining what financial literacy means, from awareness to relevance, and from relevance to really tying it to specific actions across this entire journey. And I think one question I'm sure that everyone has, if you put on your implementation hat, is that a targeted approach is too hard, right? But I think the essence of working with Swadhar, which is fundamentally around implementation of these training programs, is the fact that we always have the implementation hat as well. And the idea is not just to do research, then design, then think about scale, but rather through these live labs, you are actually able to run these small scale experiments to learn. Right? And once we've learned how to deliver these targeted trainings, how do you ensure that you have a network to scale, to test the efficacy, and then roll it out to a larger cohort? And the idea is that I'm not talking about a training that is one-to-one, which is too expensive, but rather how are we giving heuristics or shortcuts to trainers to make sure they're able to create more differentiated trainings overall, and also think about every interaction that they have with the end user as a potential moment of learning. Right? Because sometimes I think we try to cram everything into one training, and that training suddenly seems so effortful. But therefore, if you think about every interaction as a moment of learning, therefore you have like multiple ways in which you're pushing the person forward overall. So that's a little bit in terms of how we're thinking about it and how we also have the implementation hat on. And lastly, in terms of impact measurement as well, right? I think with financial literacy, it's important to think very carefully in terms of what is the metric that we're measuring. Because like I said, if we have different segments of users, their specific impact metric is different. It's not the same. You can't just think about product, trainings done, or products uptake. It's more about the specific actions for the specific groups. Because getting a woman in that household to go to a BC point is a big step forward, right? As important as getting the ASHA worker or the Anganwadi worker or the SSG leader to take an insurance products. Both of them are steps forward, and how do we think about measuring impact that is differentiated for different groups, because that is progress itself. So that's a little
Thank
bit.
you. And actually, from that sort of idea of looking at impact holistically, I wanted to zoom out a little, Shogata, and come to your question. Where we've talked a lot about this, about the approach, the power really that this behavior science focused strategy can bring to this. But I also feel, and to borrow a quote from a Marvel movie, with great power comes great responsibility. There's this idea that it can sometimes also bring unintended consequences. there can be cognitive biases that come in that may not lead to the end result that you might want. So I think again, looking at this approach, how do you feel there's ways to layer in this responsibility and this more responsible approach to it as we design that?
Yeah, thank you. It's a really interesting question, and I think one that anybody who works in this field, we grapple with all the time, right? And I think some of it relates to stuff that has come up in the discussion already. Like, for example, you're catering to different populations. How do you ensure that things are seen from their perspective, and how do you ensure that there are obviously distributional consequences to any intervention that you do. So being careful not only to monitor what's happening to the target population that you are focusing on, but what about other people around them? What about members of their household? I mean, there are so many situations where we might see that we think we're really improving outcomes for the particular person or type of person that we're focused on, but that's coming at the cost of something else that's happening, let's say, within the household or within the broader social system. So I think, but also the other piece here, and again, as good behavioral scientists, I think we should be cognizant of this all the time, but it's not always clear that we are, is, what are our own biases, what are our own preconceptions about, how are we even thinking when we're thinking about segmenting a population? Like, there might be ways that seem to us like the obvious way to go because that's just the way it's always been done. But is that necessarily the way that we should be doing it in this situation? And I think the importance of getting feedback from the people for whom this is really intended is absolutely critical. There's an example from some work that at Ideas 42 we were doing with cash transfer beneficiaries. We've actually worked now in 7 or 8 countries across Africa to design tools that really kind of meet people where they are in terms of what their needs are from this money, what their options are from this money, how can they best use it to meet their needs. And early on we were working in Madagascar, with really very, very low income populations. And we'd gone through sort of all of the process of user testing the designs and so on, and then got a local graphic designer to design the icons and so on. And then we're doing a final round of user testing, and this was the entirely woman-focused cash transfer. So one of the women looked at this poster and said, why have you brought us these posters about people in the city? And so we were a little taken aback because the clothing and so on was very much intended to capture how people in rural Madagascar lived. It turns out that what she was picking up was that the people in the posters had very even white teeth, which they said didn't feel like us. So there are these very subtle features that we have to take into account, because if we don't, we may actually have a negative impact, right? So if someone might look at this and say, oh, what you're actually telling me is this is not for me, right? And I shouldn't engage with this program or with this behavior. So I think keeping that in mind. I think the final piece is, I think we've talked earlier about what are the incentives for implementers or what are the incentives for providers. That is critical because I think in some cases the incentives are very clearly, in some sense, to create sludge rather than to really make things easier, right? And we have to, at the very least, interrogate that and understand whether that's happening consciously or whether it's something that's kind of just crept in. And in either case, what do we then do about that? So, and I think the final thing I'll say is, this point again that's come up earlier about the fact that we do work in collectives. We do think not just of ourselves, but of other people in our social context, and really thinking of designing for that. And I always remember this sort of very interesting finding from one of the early Give Directly studies when they were giving really big amounts of cash to people in Kenya, and they were measuring a whole lot of outcomes. And one thing they realized is that there had been this dramatic drop in domestic violence. And that wasn't even part of the theory of change. They hadn't even thought. Just, I think some donor had said, put in a DV question, right? And then they realized that what the cash was doing, because it was so much money, is it was leading to conversations within the household. It was leading to much more discussion between the couple And that was what was creating, less conflict, more cooperation, and less scope for violence. And so being open to these things is critical, because again, you also have findings where, you make it a woman-focused cash transfer that has sometimes led to increases in violence because there's resistance or there's resentment, right? So how do we factor the fact in that people live in these, obviously we're all social, we have other people that we're interacting with. How do we take all those perspectives into account? Thanks.
Thank you, and thank you to all of you for sharing of these learnings and insights. I think it's so interesting to hear about also how some of this comes together. I think we do have time for our quick rapid round. I just wanted to flag, I think the next live poll question might be up, so when you have a chance, do go to the app and fill that in. I wanted to come back and close with a sort of rapid question round, the same question, if each of you could take a few minutes to answer it. Coming back to our idea of really placing that customer at the center of this, I'd love for each of you to share maybe a story or an interaction with a user that happened across your work and that really brought to life some of the work or some of the effort you were doing. And maybe we go in the same order, Kanika, starting with you.
Sure. It's a really interesting question, and thanks for this panel. I've learned so much from all of you. I think the one story that always stays with me is meeting this agent in rural India, where we walked into her store. She's a very enterprising person. So to your story, Anushka, she's probably that ASHA worker. She isn't an ASHA worker, but she is a banking agent or a BC. She runs a tailoring store, so she has women coming in and out who trust her, and she advises them on fashion, and she's really someone they all look up to. And so she's an ideal BC, because what she does is she educates them on products. But what really stood out to me was the level of trust that she held amongst these women. None of them had their passbooks with them. All their passbooks were in her shop. She knew exactly which passbook belonged to whom. She knew mentally who was saving what amount for whom, and all of this was in her mind, right? And these women, because they didn't either want their families to know or their husbands to know, on their way to work would just stop by and leave that little money with her, wouldn't check if she inputted it in the passbook, wouldn't keep track of their passbook, didn't have a phone because it was shared with family, so didn't check WhatsApp updates. Said, हाँ आता है, देखते हैं कभी कभी. So they didn't even check that. So there's just this level of trust. And as I keep thinking about us wanting to become digital, the one thing that keeps coming back to me is how will we ever, or how do we start to appreciate the trust that exists in these relationships and in these communities? And what would it take to actually bring that trust into the digital world without losing this person? Her name is Usha. Without losing her and losing her relevance, how do we bring people into the digital world? So that's something that stays with me.
Thank you. Can I share two stories?
I think I have to check on time.
Okay, thank you. So it was September last year. We were in Banaras and Chandoli, and somewhere in between, we were actually conducting an interview at a 18-year-old girl's house. It evolved into a family interview, but they're not the main characters of the story. We actually wrapped up that interview, and we were just sort of loitering in the lanes, and we heard a machine run, like a machine loom. And we just sort of gravitated towards that sound, and we found one 17, 18-year-old, actually just turned 18-year-old boy, who, then we started talking to him, and we saw a QR code sort of pasted on his windowsill, and we just started talking about his journey onto digital financial services, especially given that he's 18 and he seemed to almost know everything and be that guy in the house who sort of runs the show. When we started talking a little bit more, he told us that every weekend, almost every other weekend, he rallies his friends into this, like you have that one tree in a village where everybody hangs out over there. And he would send his referral link to all of them, make them download any UPI app, and then ensure that they've all done their first transaction. Very clear and transparent with, if they've sent him 1 rupee, he returns that 1 rupee to them. And every other weekend, he's making upwards of 700-800 rupees. And when we met him, he had made somewhere around 3,500. That was really interesting that, we always look at local community influencers, really important figures in a village, but we miss out on these new age digital influencers, because as a young guy who's, he's busy with his job 6 days a week, Sunday is the only day that he's free. You wouldn't look at them as influencers or influencers in the local community, but they are quite important to rally crowds around them into a digital ecosystem. The second story that I want to share is from Araku in Andhra Pradesh. We had, I think this was again 6-7 months back, and this is on the way to Araku, it's not even in the city. So there are a lot of coffee farmers who basically set up shop on the highway, and we just stopped and we were chatting with one lady who was selling coffee. And again, we saw a sound box, and it's now, because of this study, it's like any QR code or sound box is our cue to just walk up to people and start talking to them. So we got talking, and then she said that she actually doesn't use it anymore. And her journey was basically that she was there, and an agent came and sold the device to her. She was under the impression that she was paying some other kind of charges, but over a period of time, she discovered that she'd sort of paid exponentially more than her other shop owners that she was friendly with. Higher activation fees, subscription fee, and then, she tried to call them to cancel the service, and she went into this entire spiral of trying to contact, how much everyone, I think all of us can empathize with the struggle of trying to find somebody on the other end of the phone. So she was trying to, she went through this entire spiral of trying to get grievance redressal for her issue. I think what really stood out to us was, again, what we were talking about, assistance with tech adoption, that there was somebody to onboard her and get her onto the service, but there was nobody there to walk her through the service and ensure that she continues using it and she's able to solve problems when she wants to. So these two stories actually are sort of like lighthouse stories for me from DeFi for All. Thank you.
There's so many stories to choose from, but I think I can maybe talk about one that I find was very interesting. And that's, I think, with the Swadhar program itself, and I know Urmi and we have been on the field, but I think the idea of like secret savings that women's do, right? I just love the idea, because sometimes when you think about this problem from the outside, where you say, okay, how do they have access to money in order for them to put it in these savings groups? And of course, every time you start an interview with anyone, they always, you ask them, "Aap kya karte hai?" And usually they're like, "Nahi, main kuch job nahi karti hu." And then they start talking, and then you obviously know they're working in the agricultural farm. So there's so much of like unpaid work that they're not aware of, which I think is very important for us to acknowledge and think about how we're designing for acknowledgement of that unpaid work. But as you keep going on in the conversation, they start talking about situations in which women are the ones who manage the household budget, right? And therefore they have access to money, because even if they're not actually working or have a salary, they have access to money that they're supposed to use to decide about how, where the money goes for vegetables, etc. But more importantly, I think she was talking to her husband about how sometimes she would ask for a little extra, and then she'd keep that money aside and she'd put it into almost a savings that she would not tell her husband about, right? And she'd kind of talk about this kind of sheepishly because it was her secret, even though every woman that we kind of spoke to would kind of do the same thing. And then you speak to the husbands, and in many cases, they kind of know that the secret saving exists, but they don't want to touch it because almost that becomes that savings bank for them to use for example, any sort of illness, any sort of fees that comes. So the idea is that she's not able to keep that secret savings as as a whole in a savings bank because she keeps it with her. And I think the idea was, how do you take the concept of a secret savings and kind of like put it into that separate account so it's separate from her husband, so she has ownership over, but of course she's not tempted to use it because there's so many situations that kind of come up that they want to use it. And if there's time, there's just one other thing that I wanted to mention. Was the fact that last week I was in Tharad district, which is in Gujarat, and I was actually working on a health problem. And we were trying to reduce like anemia rates because it was really high among two populations. But one of the critical stakeholders that we wanted to use in the workshop was SHG groups. And the reason why is that the state was very interested in using these women collectives that were so strong as a mechanism to also think about health-related information and behavior change. But I'm just kind of thinking about us talking about a conference of financial inclusion and the idea that SHG groups are such strong collectives that even other areas are looking to kind of leverage because it's such a strong network about how do we kind of use that better when we're thinking about formal finance. So that's a quick story.
Actually, my story that stayed with me for a long time is also about an SHG group member. And it speaks to me about this question of what we think an intervention or a product or a program is about may be very different from what the people who are using it think it's about. And so this is way back, I think it's Eastern UP, it was like Raebareli. And actually it was for a health project, but it was a health project we were trying to do with members of an SHG group. And so we're talking to all of these women who had been, in some cases, in the SHG for quite a long time. And a lot of the questions we were asking were, very kind of financial or economic, right? They were like, what have you done with the money? What has it enabled you to do? What kind of businesses have you started? Has it been easy or difficult to repay? But then there was an open-ended question where we started asking was, what has this meant to you, this being part of this SHG? What has it sort of allowed you to do? And this particular woman I remember, and I've forgotten her name unfortunately, but this is like 2014 or something, and she was fantastic. She'd given us all of these answers about the finances. But then when we said, what is the thing that the SHG has meant for you, what she said was that the biggest difference is जब हम बैंक में जाते थे तो कोई पत्ता नहीं मिलता था. अब जब जाते मैनेजर कहते हैं मैडम बैठिए. And for her that was much more important than the literal amounts of money or the business. It was the respect that she was now getting from somebody who earlier didn't give her any, right? And so if you think about the product, is it a financial product, or is it something that's enhancing social capital, or is it something that's getting someone to be seen in a different way? And therefore, of course, also building confidence and building the ability to do more things. I think that's always stayed with me because I felt like if I hadn't heard it from her, there's no way I would have come up with this as the primary thing that the SHG had enabled. So yeah.
No, that's wonderful, and I think Madam Bethe is a great note on which to end this discussion. I think we have time for maybe a couple of questions if there's anyone in the audience who has a question.
Hello. Hi, I'm Kripa. I represent an NGO called Sampar. And we've been doing this grassroots initiatives for about 32 years. And with us, we've got some SHG women also for the meeting. They are sitting here from Varanasi. So the stories of Varanasi, we were translating to them. It's extremely interesting to see how the learnings from the grassroots, which we get, is being imbibed into the sector as a model, an approach, and we're very happy to learn about your work and how you've integrated many stuff. We like to know the other side of the challenges to it. Like, whenever we do this work, what now I've got a picture is, how open are the industries to take your suggestions? While we go back with all these suggestions to them, which is what we've also been doing for so long, we like to hear stories from that side, and also to understand the percentage of the overall acceptance. Like this, I won't call this a niche, this is very needed, but does the industry feel that this is essential? That's what I would like to know. This is still considered as something, a luxury item, which is over and beyond if we have a time to do, let's engage in this. Or do they feel it's essential? Because by and large, when you discuss with these women, the questions are totally different, right? It's like about having a paper in my name. How would I get the document if the app is going to tell that, get me that document? How many percentage of women in India own property documents in their names? You know, are companies ready to engage into these discussions? Or do they just alienate it? Or because you guys are there in the middle, like doing this work on the field and talking to their clients, whereas we are primarily in the field. So our voice is always subdued. But how do you guys feel that there is, how do they invite your suggestions? How often do you face challenges? Please throw some light on that. That will be interesting.
Anyone particular you'd like to, anyone wants to start off by?
I'm happy to take a stab, but that's a tricky question. And it's a challenge we faced as well. I think I'll say one thing that we have seen emerging more and more, and probably not necessarily for the absolute grassroots as yet, is that people have started, decision makers have started to understand that it is important to make what you're building relevant for the customer, because at some point you will otherwise lose steam. So I think there is an understanding and there is an appreciation for knowing the customer better. But it comes with these trade-offs like time, budget. Like you said, it's sometimes considered luxury. What we're seeing, and it's probably starting at the top and hopefully will trickle down, is that it is becoming part of the process. So design thinking teams are now very much embedded within product teams, or within, in fact, even within banks, the large banks. Agile teams, so teams that are thinking about quick prototyping, quick experimentation, learning from customers. And I think going back to Shogato's point, I think given that we're moving into a data economy and into a more personalization, customizing products, I think it's becoming more and more relevant to know who your different sets of customers are. But right now it's more data driven than story or people driven, but I think it's slowly happening but not fast enough.
Add to that. Thank you, Krupa, for your question. I completely agree with everything you said, Kanika, but I just wanted to add that with coming back to DeFi for all, what we're actually striving to do is what I was talking about earlier, is to be very granular and specific in the kind of findings. So exactly what you said, that how many women actually have property papers in their name, how many women actually face the struggle of editing their surname in their Aadhaar card after they get married, after if they get divorced, or if they get separated or widowed, and different sort of life situations happen. It's our responsibility to be very specific and actionable in the kind of stories that we find out, and not to leave it at a very high and generic level that it just passes off as, yeah, okay, this is a good thing to know, or this is a good knowledge bank, which then makes it difficult for policymakers and providers to really put into action. So I think with this study, that's what we're really, it's a very important focus area for us, which is why we're at a conference such as this, and other kinds of conferences. We've been trying to engage providers to give them very specific kind of stories, like you said, and not leave it at very institutional or systemic guidances.
Thank you. I think we had one more question this side.
Yeah. I'm Chandramouli from SIDBI. So really excited with this behavioral aspect of this. This is microfinance is a financial inclusion tool. Now from a JLG model, gradually it is upgrading to individual financing. Now these MFIs, there are two aspects where the behaviorally the woman, whether they should focus more on the benefits of individual loan, or on the downside of their CIBIL scores getting affected, or
they will be hoodwinked by a AI tool, or now it's progressing to individual loans, higher tickets. These women, whether they are capable of handling these higher loans, particularly at the hinterland, and whether focusing more on the downside will intimidate him, because MFIs gradually are increasing the ticket size for various reasons. Whether a focus should be behaviorally on telling them on the downside of that, or the prospects of a bigger loan and they empowering, becoming big. So what do you feel behaviorally, how carefully the MFI should focus on? Behavior, you've worked in different countries and geographies. Think of a rural woman and a Araku or a very different place. Suddenly, if you give a, there the market is also lower. Suddenly they were doing 30,000, 40,000 borrowing. Now 1.5 lakh. Repayment also becomes tougher. So we have to carefully, because just it is not a business proposition to increase the ticket size. We have to think what are their capabilities and whether they'll feel intimidated by the downside of what can happen. I hope I'm communicating.
No, please.
So of course, my answer would always be like, let's go ask the end user, have a discussion, understand what their goals are, what is relevant. But I think one thing is that sometimes we feel fear is a good motivator, especially in the health system, for example. A lot of providers use fear as the biggest motivator to drive behavior. But I don't think fear is the best motivator in certain cases. Explaining the downside should be done, but not in a way to elicit fear, but a way of coping with that particular risk, right? So I can't say that is fear better or is relevance better, but I do think it's important for a person to understand the whole idea when you're taking the loan, what might be the issues you're going to face, but you have to help them understand how do you cope with that as well. So it's not fear that makes you disengage or avoid, but rather fear that makes, but rather coping that helps you manage those risks in a way. But of course, I do think you also need to frame it in a way that it's relevant to the user overall. So that's just one quick point.
I think the only other two quick things I'd add is, one is how do you progressively build them up to that capability, right? If they're at 40,000 rupees today, 1.5 lakh might not be the logical next step on that ladder. It might be 70,000 to 1 lakh to 1.2. We actually designed a loan ladder system for a Ugandan startup, and we saw default rates drop by 36%. Because you were progressively enabling them to understand the risks associated with higher ticket sizes, helping them understand how they should use that excess money that's coming in. So sometimes it's probably they might not know what they can do with 1.5 lakhs. So how do you unlock that for them slowly? And just the only other thing is the temptation to go higher, like you said, is very high. It should be accompanied with some safety nets. So we talk a lot about designing for error states and designing for negative flows. So I think those safety nets, if they exist, are great. I don't know what they should look like at that state, but that's something I'd prompt.
Maybe I can add to the safety net. I think
we just have time for one more question. So I'll just check if you have any more questions. I think you have one more, maybe. So maybe Shweta, we can.
Yeah, thank you. I'm Shweta from Axion. This question is for you, Anushka, maybe just given your experience with the financial literacy program. I think a lot of what you were talking about, the tunneling as well as heterogeneous groups, right? Ultimately, it has to be scalable, the solutions that we are coming up with. Or we might even be talking about mass personalization of such products. I wanted to know, can you give me some examples of maybe principles that you were able to apply that can be scalable, right? I mean, even if you talked about the silent observer versus the prabhavak.
Yes.
And how would you be able to train, given that there are different people sitting in a group?
Perfect. I think that's a great question. So I think in terms of the project that we did on trying to drive engagement in PMJDY accounts, I think for each of the behavioral insights, the idea was to think about solutions, right? So specifically around the idea of the cognitive tunnel, I think the idea was that how do you reframe or create new products which are more aligned to the end user and talk to examples from informal finance that they could learn to reduce that distance. And of course, I can share, there's like a detailed book on it to kind of show how we reduce that distance between short-term and long-term through trying to reframe some of the policies as well as create potentially better policies that might be more applicable and relevant to the user. I think the second point is how do we think about reducing psychological distance? I think you already have BC Points, Bank Mitras, but how do you kind of frame their role, not just to kind of build awareness, but reduce the distance, right? So there were certain principles on that. When we're talking about the Swadhar program, like you correctly did say, right? When you are thinking about doing mass trainings, how do you kind of like customize it? So we thought about this from an implementation point of view because we're implementing the program itself. So one way you could think about doing is the fact that we have almost, now we've come to a list of short questions or identifiers for a specific segment. So for example, if you want to do a group that's specifically for the optimistic influencer, which I talked about, you know what are the characteristics of those women. So how do you form smaller groups with the women in the village? Because these are the people who would anyway be most open to the kind of training. So one is that how then the trainer is going into a village, how do you create the groups that are more slightly homogeneous in order for you to do the trainings in one way? The second way we could think about doing it is that when you're starting a training, there could be a couple of questions that you did ask that you kind of divide the group into two parts. And then you do certain activities that are more relevant but also speak to the two. Because if we're able to talk to the specific barriers of individuals, they will self-select into specifically paying attention to that information. So again, the idea was, like I said, it's not a one-to-one training, not possible, right? But rather, how are we giving heuristics to the trainer to understand who's in the group and therefore kind of customize and tailor the training. So rather than a one-size-fits-all, it's slightly differentiated. Or when we're talking about creating the homogeneous groups whenever possible, how do you ensure that it's more targeted and tailored to the individual itself? And happy to kind of like share some of the work that we're doing with Swadhar as well to kind of show how it is actually implementable. And I think dev sector as a whole kind of moves away or shies away from targeted approaches because it feels like not inclusive. But the idea is if we move towards more of an equity perspective, we need to understand the different barriers so we get to the whole, right? Rather than thinking about the one-size-fits-all gets to the whole, but rather targeted approaches will meet the whole given the different barriers and the needs. Using the existing resources, which I think is important to acknowledge.
Thank you, and sorry, I think we're out of time. I know we had a couple more questions, but please do find the panelists after this over tea, coffee, and ask those. I was very glad that we had that interaction and questions. Thank you again to our wonderful panelists for sharing so much about your work and your insights, and thank you to the Access team.
Thank you so much, panelists, and thank you so much, moderator. As a token of our appreciation, we would like to gift you with a memento and also come forward for a photograph, so maybe we can do that first. I know people have a lot of questions, so you can catch them at the networking break, tea and coffee area, and please continue to have the conversation forward. Okay. We'll now take a short break and we'll come back for our next session at 11:30. So please go grab your coffee and come back at 11:30. See you here. The next session over here is on